Hi there, Michael here. One of the first things people new to Dolby Atmos usually ask me is, where is the master channel? How can I glue everything together the way I do it in stereo? Well, the thing is that working with Atmos has a couple of very substantial differences in terms of production workflow, and one of them is that there is no master bus in Dolby Atmos. Mastering in Dolby Atmos is actually more of a mixing than a mastering process. However, if you want to bring in a more traditional mastering workflow to Dolby Atmos, there are tools available that can help you achieve that. I've talked about a few of these tools in the past, most notably the Dolby Atmos Composer by Fiedler Audio. There's also the Sump plugin by Hornet Plugins, which allows you to create something similar to a master bus in Dolby Atmos. I did a video about Sump a while ago. I'll leave some links in the description below. In today's video, we're going to have a look at a new tool that does something very similar to Sump. The plugin is called Meld, and it comes from Metric Halo. And while Meld is a bit on the expensive side, it does have a few features that I haven't yet seen before and which will certainly be very appealing for professionals in the field. But enough said, let's open up Reaper and check out Meld. Now I'm going to work with Reaper today, and I'm going to work on a Mac, and as it turns out, this will actually become an issue because Meld has a bug that makes it really unusable with Reaper, but we will be able to at least kind of go through all the features of Meld so I can show you essentially how Meld works. And once we get to the bug, you will see that bug and it will kind of shock you. But before I get to that bug, let's first have a brief listen to what we have here. Now, this is a very simple set of loops that I'm sometimes using in order to demonstrate things in Dolby Atmos. It contains of 3 tracks, a drums track, a bass track, and a synth track. And what I've done is I've added additional sends into a reverb track, and that reverb track is a 16-channel 9.1.6 track that includes an instance of Cinematic Rooms Professional that essentially turns everything into a 9.1.6 reverb. And then in order to turn it into Dolby Atmos, I'm using the Dolby Atmos Composer. So here I have the reverb. The reverb is a composite containing the 10 bad channels and then 6 additional objects. So the first 16 objects in the Atmos session are this composite, and then the 3 tracks are separately routed into stereo objects here. So the first 22 channels are essentially what we have here. Now, in order to route them, what I'm doing is I'm using the Dolby Atmos Beam plugin. So here, for example, the Dolby Atmos Beam plugin on a stereo track, and I moved things around a little, just a little bit in order to give a little bit more of an immersive impression. But it doesn't really actually make any difference for what we want to do. And once again, we do the same thing with the 9.1.6. So here we have the 9.1.6 reverb track that is routed into the Dolby Atmos Composer. So let's just press play. So once again, we have the 16 channels from the reverb, and then we have the 6 objects. So if I'm muting the reverb, for example, I'm now only hearing the objects. Or if I'm muting the objects, I'm only hearing the reverb. So let's add Meld, and before we do that, we should probably talk a little bit about what Meld actually is. And in its simplest form, Meld is a channel strip plugin, but it is a very special channel strip plugin because it allows you to communicate across different instances of Meld, and that allows you to control the parameters across an entire range of tracks or objects in your Dolby Atmos session simultaneously, and that makes it almost like a master bus. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add an instance of Meld here first to the reverb track. That is a 9.1.6 track. So let me add Meld here. And going to use the VST3 version. And if you're opening up Meld, you feel right at home because after all, it is a channel strip plugin. So we have an EQ here. We have a compressor here. We have Mixhead, which is a saturation plugin. We have loudness, which I believe is an upward compressor, so it increases the loudness of your tracks. And we have a limiter. We can turn them on or off depending on what we need. And we can rearrange them in case we don't like the order. So I can move the compressor here after the saturation or the other way around. And then we have an input gain, we have an output gain. And here we have the overview that kind of shows us everything that's going on. And here on the right side, we have what's really special about Meld, and that is the list of all the individual instances that you have in your session. Now, currently, I only have one instance, and we're going to change that now. So let's add additional instances to the other 3 tracks. But before I do that, I need to make sure that Meld is in the correct spot, because currently it sits after the Dolby Atmos Beam plugin. And if you're working with the Dolby Atmos Composer, you know that there's actually no audio coming through. It actually needs to sit in front of the Beam plugin in order for that to work. And then let's add additional instances of Meld. So we're going to add one here. And let's close that and also move that ahead of the Beam plugin. And let's do the same thing for the other tracks as well. Let's move that ahead. Oopsie. So, and final one. Let's move that ahead of the Beam plugin. And if I'm now opening an instance of Meld, so let's open up the instance that sits on the reverb track. I now see on the right side all the individual instances of Meld, and I can control them from that particular instance. Now, what makes Meld so unique is that I can now group them into entire groups. So, for example, I can say that the reverb should be in group A, and then the synth, bass, and drums are all in group B, so that I can actually control them simultaneously. And what that will do is it will allow you to make changes to all of those instances simultaneously. So if I'm now opening up one of those instances in group B, so let me just open up the instance here that sits on the drums track, and then maybe also open up the instance here that sits on the bass track. So if I'm now changing something in the drums track, and I just kind of moved it around a little so that you can see what's going on here. So if I'm, for example, now changing the parameters of filter number 7, it will actually change on all instances that are belonging to that particular group. And that makes it very convenient because, once again, what you now have is really something that is very similar to a master bus, just for Dolby Atmos. Now, what makes this so super unique or so particularly useful is the side chaining. And in order to create, let's put it that way. By default, the way this works is that the compressor and the limiter act to the signal that is coming on that particular track. So each instance will sort of be its own sidechain signal, if you like. But you can actually change that by enabling shared sidechain support. So if you click on that here, what you have is you have an additional option. And actually, for that to see, we need to go into the compressor settings. So let me just enable the compressor here. So let's turn that on and off again. So you see here the cogwheel. So if I'm kind of disabling that, that disappears. I have to say that the interface of Meld is a little bit wonky. You need to get used to it, but it's not. It's okay. It's not that bad. It's okay. But you could probably improve a little. Matrix Halo. So you might be able to kind of get a little bit of a better user interface. Anyway, so we wanted to enable sidechain support. So now what I have this additional cogwheel here. And this cogwheel now allows me to configure how that sidechain works. So I can say, for example, everything in that particular group should be in the sidechain. I can say everything that is listening to the sidechain, which currently none is listening to the sidechain, can be in the sidechain. All channels can be in the sidechain. And I see which channels are in or which tracks are in the sidechain. I see that here with the green dot. Or I can also kind of create something manual. So for example, I can say I only want the drums to be in the sidechain. And what tracks are listening to the sidechain is selected here with the CSC and LSC settings. So I can, for example, say the drums here are going to act on the sidechain in the reverb only. And that will make sure that the signal from the drums is then controlling the compressor and the limiter of the reverb only and not nothing else, and not anything else. So this allows you to essentially be really, really flexible. So let's just close that again and let's maybe play around with that a little. And for that, let me close all the instances that are not belonging to the reverb. So this is the reverb instance, and let's play the audio. And if I now enable the compressor, essentially the sidechain, the drums essentially are driving the compressor here in the reverb. And what I can do, for example, is I can use that in order to do some, kind of sidechain pumping if I want to. And obviously, the same thing also goes for, kind of any of the settings in the limiter. So if I want to have the limiter be controlled, I can also do that with the sidechain. And that actually is really, really, really cool. Now, a couple of other features that are really interesting. We can change the polarity settings of each track. So we can invert the polarity of the audio. Or we can also do a DC block. And that's actually really interesting. I haven't seen that in any other plugin. And that seems to indicate that this is really a plugin aimed at professionals, because you probably only need that if you're using outward geared. Because what that does is it implements a very, very low filter, high-pass filter that kind of filters out the DC signal that can build up if you have multi-channel tracks. But, kind of if you are working in the box, you're probably never going to encounter that. But once again, a very interesting feature that I haven't seen anywhere else. And then you might have seen that we have trim settings here for the input, for the output. We have meters that tell us how everything is going, and we have essentially the LUFS and the dBs that are measured, so we can measure everything. And unfortunately, as I said, the interface is a little bit wonky. So the additional settings for the sidechain are also can be enabled or disabled here in this interface, but it's generally not visible. And there's this very weird thing in Reaper that if I'm actually changing that, it doesn't really rescale. So unfortunately, that is a little bit wonky. Once again, it's also quite frankly very weird. This is the smallest setting for the interface, so I can go up to 250%. I'm not quite sure. So once again, kind of the interface could use a little bit help. My feeling is that it's probably really aimed at people who are working with Pro Tools, and in Pro Tools it probably works. But here it's a little bit weird. So let's just say it like that. So let's kind of set that back to the smallest 60%, because that's really the only way for me to use that in any meaningful way. So where's the bug? I promised you a bug, and so far it seems everything is okay, right? Unfortunately, it's not, because if you now save everything, so let me just close that here, and let's save the project, and let's close Reaper maybe, and then let's reopen that project. If I now open up Meld, it has forgotten the group assignments. So it's not saving the group assignments. Now, this is a known bug. It has been known since day one. As far as I understand, they promised an update that will fix that currently. And I'm recording that at the end of November. So it's now 2 months out. It's not really working yet. So we will see if that's actually kind of something they're going to fix. Now, my understanding is this is a particular bug that only appears in certain digital audio workstations, particularly in Reaper. So if you're working with Pro Tools, it's supposed to be working fine. If you're working with other digital audio workstations, it might work or might not work. You might also need to switch over to different plugin versions. I unfortunately have only the VST3 version and the audio unit version because I'm on a Mac, and in both cases that is the behavior that I'm experiencing. Now, in general, kind of if you have like a track like that only has like 4 tracks, right? If you have a session like that where you only have 4 tracks, not that big of a deal. You can reassign them. So essentially you go back in and you kind of assign them again, and then everything is set up the way it's supposed to be again. But if you are working in a professional environment, which once again this plugin is really targeted at, and you have like maybe hundreds of tracks, you can't go the route. You cannot go back in and kind of reassign everything. It doesn't make sense. So my strong recommendation, test it before you do anything, because it might work or it might not work. If it works, it is really, really cool. It is a very, very useful plugin. And I think a lot of professionals are going to appreciate that. Other than the very nasty bug here in the savings procedure, it actually works quite well. So what's my final verdict? Well, I think although quite expensive, Meld is a very interesting addition to the immersive audio plugin ecosystem. At least in theory, it really does offer everything you would need in a master bus-based Dolby Atmos workflow. The channel effects are based on Metric Halo's highly regarded effects plugins, so no complaints there. Unfortunately, the software still has a few bugs, most noticeably the fact that saving in certain DAWs, particularly in Reaper, does not work. This, quite frankly, is a huge one, which is very annoying given the $400 price tag. So before you buy, make absolutely sure that you test it thoroughly. Besides that, my only complaint at this point is that the user interface and the user experience in general are a bit on the wonky side. Now, this is not that unusual for plugins that are aimed at professionals, as anybody making a living with these plugins is really mainly interested in the functionality and not how pretty it looks or how easy it is to learn. But I do think that this limits the market somewhat. Personally, I would not recommend Meld to hobbyists or anybody just starting out. If you fall into that category, I think it's better to either subscribe to the general Dolby Atmos philosophy of working without a master bus, or you can get a plugin such as Xampp from Hornet Plugins, which is very similar but costs significantly less than Meld. But if you are a professional working in Dolby Atmos, especially if you have transitioned from stereo production to Dolby Atmos production and are missing your old workflow, then Meld is certainly something to consider. Once they fix that save bug, that is. Well, that's everything for today. If you have any questions or comments, drop them in the comment section below or join our free Discord server. The invite link is in the description. And don't forget to subscribe to stay updated on all things Dolby Atmos and immersive audio. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you all in the next video.